So much. Okay, right, got it. Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much to Paul for organizing all of this. It's been really fantastic. I've really enjoyed all the other talks, and a lot of the content of the other talks has been directly or indirectly relevant to what I'm talking about today. So hopefully I'll be able to make some reference to that as I go along. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I'm really pleased that Paul yesterday talked about how we define epic and the various different criteria we use for this, because that's where I'm going to dive right in. I think that Paul is absolutely right when he said that either implicitly or explicitly calling something an epic is always something to do with Homer. And so many of the criteria we use when in Europe, when we think about epic, are related to Homer. So there are a few things that come to mind. Firstly, orality. So we think of epics, at least in the early stages of epic traditions, as stemming from a tradition of oral storytelling. Secondly, antiquity. Clearly, this isn't a necessary condition, but as we'll see when I go into talking about Chinese scholars in the 20th century, this was something that helps in the definition of an epic. Thirdly, subject matter. So we think of epics primarily as involving the grand exploits of heroes or gods, events of great historical or mythical importance. And so for Aristotle, like tragedies, epics are supposed to depict the noble and the great. Fourth, length. Here's another bit of a weird category, because really how long is long? This is something that, again, will come up. But in general, we think of epic as having some kind of length. Fifth, meter. At least traditionally speaking, an epic is a verse, it's a poem. And sixth, narrative. So Plato, in Europe, we have the long-standing sort of tripartite, triangular division of the epic, the lyric, and the tragic or the dramatic. So which kind of map onto narrative, storytelling for the epic, expressing of one's individual emotions for the lyric, and to dramatic, viewing something on a stage or having some kind of interaction between characters for the tragic. So for Plato, the lyric is one person talking from themselves, the tragic, two people or more talking to one another, and the epic as some kind of mix of the two, where the poet is talking, but they are also describing people talking to one another. For Goethe, these three may be even within one single work: the epic, the tragic, and the lyric, because the epic is sort of saying something directly, direct storytelling. Dramatic is to do with acting out something, and lyric is to do with being overcome with one's emotion and bringing that emotion to the audience. So clearly epic is closely tied with narrative, with telling a story, and this has enormous implications when we come to China. So seventh, function. Historically, Europeans have seen in the epic the presentation of great people who we should aspire to be like. So the English poet Sidney, in his defense of poesy, and admittedly he is defending poetry, so he is very much bigging it up. He says of heroic poetry that, quote, "as the image of each action stirreth and instructeth the mind, so the lofty image of such worthies most inflameth the mind with desire to be worthy, and informs with counsel how to be worthy." So heroic epics at least ought to make us want to be better people, and also to show us how. Finally, there's an element of linguistic register to the epic. So especially in the Renaissance, there was a very important scheme called the genera dicendi, the manners of speaking. So again, divided into three: the highest, the middle, and the low. And epic writing was the grand style, supposed to be grand, stately, formal, worthy of respect. It's not the kind of language where you have slang or local popular expressions, potentially. So now let's go to China. The first time the idea of the epic really made waves in China was in the mid-19th century, when the Protestant missionary Joseph Aikens wrote in Chinese, intended to introduce the Homeric epics to a Chinese audience. And to make the concept easier to understand, he refers to the famous poet Du Fu, who was a foundational poet in China and known in Chinese as a poet historian, because he wrote many poems that not only recorded historical events, but also passed moral judgment on them, which was traditionally an important job of historians in China. So Aikens draws this link to emphasize that the Homeric epics were in some sense histories and to kind of make them more familiar to a Chinese audience. So the Chinese word for poet historian is shishi. Yes, shishi. But the word that will come to be common for epic is the same two characters, but switched around, shishi, history poem. And a reminder that Chinese is a tonal language, so these are different characters. As Chinese people learned more and more about the West over the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there emerged a problem. So why doesn't China have an epic like Europe or like India or many other civilizations? So this problem became known as the shishi wenti, the problem of the epic, and it would be widely discussed throughout the 20th century by many of China's most prominent scholars, such as this mustachioed fellow here, Lu Xun. So why was this such a big deal? In the early 20th century, China underwent an enormous intellectual shift. So following the kind of military disasters throughout the 19th century of the Opium Wars, where Western powers, especially Britain, come in and basically bully the Chinese, confronted with this sort of technological military might of Western powers and increasingly Japan, many Chinese people began to call for modernization with the aim of giving China more power to stand up for itself on the international stage. It was felt by some that China had to rid itself of its traditional culture and especially Confucian ideology in order to achieve this modernization. So this was the New Culture movement, and later the May 4th movement, which took the name of the nationalist protests on Tiananmen Square against the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Because this treaty, although China and Japan were both allies of the victors in World War I, the treaty gave former German colonies not back to China, but to Japan instead, which understandably made a lot of Chinese people very, very angry. So members of these new movements founded important magazines like New Youth, Xinxinyan, which spread ideas about nationalism and anti-traditionalism, including the promotion of vernacular literature over and against elite classical literature. So in this period, there was this kind of confusing mix of at once a great deal of nationalism, but also a sense of national self-doubt, even self-loathing. And it was felt by many that China's traditional culture was toxic and had stunted China's technological and intellectual growth. So there was at once anti-Western sentiment, but also the sense that China needed to learn from the West if it was going to become powerful. And many figures of the May 4th movement were educated in Western countries. So it's against this backdrop that some scholars, not finding an equivalent to Western epics, saw in this a failure of the Chinese literary tradition. China has tons of fantastic poetry, but crucially, not really long narrative poetry. So epic literature being seen as the pinnacle and the foundation point, and in some ways the essence of Western culture and literature. So the apparent lack of this in China became a real sticking point. Many scholars have offered their opinions on why this may have been, why China may not have developed an epic in the Homeric style. So we've just seen Wang Guowei, who lays the blame squarely on Confucian ideas about literature, in which the primary function of literature is didactic. It's about being a tool for the improvement of society and for self-cultivation, and not a pure, non-functional kind of fantastic work of art. So in fact, this idea of Chinese culture as being essentially unimaginative and focused only on the practical can be seen as early as Hegel, who argued that the reason the Chinese have no national epic is because of their, quote, fundamentally prosaic outlook. And Zheng Zhenduo and Lu Xun also emphasized the impact of Confucianism. For Zheng Zhenduo, there must have been the material in terms of myths and legends, because there are myths and legends in China, to construct an epic in early times, but because of the influence of Confucianism, this was not passed down. And both Zheng Zhenduo and Lu Xun were famous advocates of Chinese fiction and vernacular and popular literature more generally. So it's no surprise also to see Zheng lay the blame for the absence of epic poetry on the elite regulated verse form, which was nightmarishly strict in its structural principles, very short lines, and each character in each place within the line has to have a particular tone, and then the next line has to have the opposite tones. So very, very difficult to construct, and this led to a tendency to produce short poems and not long ones, in Zheng's opinion. Lu Xun points out that Confucius famously rejected talk of gods or ghosts, preferring instead to discuss earthly matters of hierarchy and social harmony and how to be a good ruler. So he also, Lu Xun, links this to the hardships faced by early Chinese people living in the Yellow River Basin, believing that in these circumstances, there would have been no room for idle storytelling. They would not have had the time living in these difficult conditions. So Zhu Guangqian actually turns this discourse on its head a little bit. He sees in this a matter of pride for Chinese literature, because for him, early Chinese society was precocious in its thinking. It was already casting aside these infantile pantheons of gods, and instead was thinking of the divine in a more abstract and a more distant way, which he thinks of as more modern or at least more mature. He also argues that by nature, Chinese culture focuses on the static, so on sages and their internal virtue and their government, rather than on heroes and their kind of running around doing wild and dynamic exploits, which led to a more lyric, reflective, subjective, and less of a narrative and objective sensibility. And this really ties into one of the main dichotomies that's often drawn between East and West, and especially East and West literature, which is East as feeling and lyric, and West as kind of rational and objective. And this goes back to Aristotle and his idea of mimesis. So art ought to represent things that are out there. It ought to be a kind of objective copying of life. To be honest, none of these responses are enormously convincing, and some of them are outright, if not Orientalist, at least essentialist. We see in some of them attacks on traditional Chinese culture that are clearly situated within the context of the new culture movement that we just looked at. So instead of accepting this, many scholars in the early 20th century went on the hunt, searching for the Chinese epic that would restore some national pride and prove that Chinese literature was on an equal footing with other global literatures. The famous reformer Liang Qichao's response to this question is to widen the definition of poetry. So the direct Chinese equivalent of the term poetry is shi, and this is relatively narrow. A lot of Chinese forms that are metrical, but maybe not rhymed, are not considered shi in Chinese, but kind of maybe would be in English. So Liang seeks to widen the definition of poetry to include some of the giants of Chinese literature, such as Qu Yuan and Song Yu, who wrote works in some of these other kind of still metrical, but not poetry forms. In truth, these works are quite long by Chinese standards, but nowhere near what we are used to in terms of epic length. So he goes a step further, and he includes works by Tang Xianzu, Kong Shangren, and Jiang Shiquan, who are mostly famous for their dramatic writings. Tang Xianzu actually lived contemporaneously to Shakespeare and is even sometimes called China's Shakespeare. He died in the same year in 1616, and on the anniversary in 2016, Shakespeare's Globe did a big project where they compared the two, and they put on some of Tang Xianzu's works in London. So these dramatic works are also, they're very long, but can opera or plays, because these are really opera, they're sung, they're put to music, can they really be considered epics? It's kind of a bit of a question mark. In his efforts to prove that Chinese writers are not lacking in talent and really focusing especially on length as a condition, both for epic and for talent itself, even when this length is only really relative, Liang dramatically expands the definitions of both epic and poetry. So other scholars would similarly define the Chinese epic based on criteria that matched their particular aims. First, let's look at wenti. So based on scraps of myths and legends that survived, he argued that ancient China must have had an epic to transmit these legends about the founding of the earliest either semi or entirely mythical Chinese dynasties. His reasoning was that it was the right kind of era, it was the right kind of society, so transitioning from a clan-based society to a slave society. It was based on a conflict between two peoples, like the Achaeans and the Trojans, in this case, the Chinese Xia people and the barbarian Yi. And given that it would have been transmitted in a society without widespread literacy or convenient writing equipment, it would most likely have been transmitted in verse, he thinks, to have aided memory. Clearly, all of this is very speculative, and it's also very clearly kind of directly correlating to the Homeric epics. This guy here is Da Yu, is the guy he thinks would have been in one of these epics, and he tamed the floods in one of the many flood stories that you see across the world. His father tried to do it by damming up the floods, but he didn't have the answer. Yu has the answer. He dredges the rivers, and he ends the floods. So this is the reason I've included antiquity in my very basic set of possible criteria for the epic, because it's very obvious that many Chinese scholars were looking for something as old as, or ideally older than, the ancient Western epics. So Wen argued that certain parts of this speculative epic have been passed down in the extant Classic of Documents, which is one of the 5 Confucian classics which were supposedly compiled by Confucius from existing materials, and then became the core of the Confucian curriculum for several thousand years. So the Songs of the Five Sons is found within this classic. Here's an extract. I won't read it to you. You can see it's about government. It is not very poetic. However, you can see that the original, I mean that the translation isn't very poetic. Leg is an okay translator, but the original is much more clearly written in 4 character blocks mostly, and this is the meter that Wen believed the original epic would have been written in. I'll just read a little bit in Mandarin, not in Old Chinese, unfortunately, just so you get a sense. So, 名为邦本，本固邦营，与世天下，渔夫渔妇，亦能胜于, and so on. Another candidate was put forward by the husband and wife dream team, Lu Kairu and Feng Yuanjun. So this was the so-called Epic of Zhou that was later dubbed also the Weniad. So Lu and Feng argued that some of the older poems in the Shijing, the Classic of Odes, another one of the Confucian classics, together form a coherent Epic of Zhou, describing the founding of the Zhou dynasty. So from the ancestors of the founders to King Wen, who received the mandate of heaven to overthrow the previous dynasty, down to King Wu, this fellow who completes this work. He overthrows the previous dynasty once and for all, and he founds the Zhou dynasty in around 1046 BC. So let's look at a couple of these poems. First is Birth to the People, Shengmin. So this tells of how Jiang Yuan gives birth to Hou Ji, the mythical ancestor of the Zhou ruling clan, and she conceives him when she treads on the big toe of God's footprint. And I didn't realize this, but this is apparently a common myth around the world, that you have people conceiving this sort of immaculate conception through stepping on a god's or a giant's or some other person's footprint. So no matter how they try and get rid of him, and who they is here is not entirely clear. It doesn't really state. In some other versions, I think it's Jiang Yuan herself. In some other versions, it may be her husband. In any case, someone is trying to get rid of Hou Ji, but they put him in a narrow lane, but the oxen and the sheep tenderly cherish him. They put him on cold ice, but the birds cover him with their wings. So nature and fate are insistent on keeping him alive. And when he grows up, Hou Ji is engaged in some very successful agriculture. This is because in legend, he is supposed to have been the person who introduced millet to the people of China. He is the sort of founder of agriculture in a sense. And his name actually means Lord Millet. So let's look at another one. Sovereign Might, Huang Yi. So this tells the story of how God decides that the previous dynasties have been a catastrophe. The governance had been all awry. And this is the usual pattern in Chinese historiography. You get a great conqueror who founds a new dynasty. They're wonderful and virtuous, and that's why they get to be king. But then it gets worse and worse and worse. And eventually the final ruler is decadent and tyrannical and cruel. And so someone else has to come along to overthrow him. So God comes across King Wen, and he gives him the mandate of heaven to overthrow the incumbent king. Now, this Epic of Zhou meets a lot of criteria. So it's very old. In theory, it would have been orally transmitted. It's very grand in subject matter and register and so on. And an advantage of designating this as the Chinese epic is that the Classic of Odes and the poems within it were indeed foundationally important to Chinese literature as a whole. So in that sense, it can be seen as somewhat equivalent to the epic tradition in Europe. And again, going back to what Paul was saying yesterday, both this and the previous epic proposed by Wen Yidor that may or may not have existed, are both based in a founding of a dynasty. It's kind of the founding of the Chinese people. It's very much tying in with that nationalistic feature of the epic, right? However, it must be said that it is not really these poems in the Classic of Odes that were the most influential or the most foundational to Chinese literature. It's also really very speculative that this series of poems can be read as a whole in the first place. They're not put next to each other within the Classic of Odes. And even if we are meant to read them together, we don't know how long the completed epic would have been. So scholars have always considered these also to have been hymns performed at rituals or ceremonies for the ancestors, right? So we may also question whether this kind of song of praise really counts as an epic in the same way as storytelling purely for entertainment. Hu Shi was another majorly important figure in the May 4th movement, and he wrote a very, very famous history of vernacular literature in which he actually agrees with Lu Xun and some of the people we've talked about in arguing that there is no ancient epic in China because, at least in the northern heartlands, there was no spare labor for any imaginative endeavors, and he thinks that they were a simple and a plain people, so they didn't come up with these things. However, he believed that epics, or what he interestingly calls story poems, though we know he means epic because he puts the English term in brackets, circulated among the people in later periods, partly due to the influence of Southerners and their kind of more rich mythological imagination. So his primary example is Southeast the Peacock Flies, which is 孔雀东南飞. This was written sometime in the first half of the first millennium AD. And it's not entirely sure when, and Hu Shi argues about this a little bit because some people say it was later and that it was influenced by Buddhism. He doesn't like this. He doesn't want it to have been influenced by Buddhism. It's a native Chinese tradition. So it's written entirely in 5-character lines and is, by the standards of Chinese poetry, really quite long. And the story goes like this. So a young bride is very unhappy with her mother-in-law. This young bride, she can weave silk, she can cut clothes, she can play the lute, she's educated and virtuous, but no matter how much she weaves, it's never enough for her mother-in-law, who grumbled at her slowness. So she says, the work is more than I can cope with. What use in my staying any longer? So the husband goes to his mum and he says, you know, I found this wonderful wife. She hasn't done anything wrong. Basically, what's your problem? But the mother blows up and she says, oh, for a long time, I found her infuriating. She doesn't have propriety. She's selfish and willful and all these things. So following this, and I haven't quoted this bit, the son tells his wife, he's kind of like, oh, you know, right, my mum. So, because the mum wants him to marry someone else. So he tells his wife, I'll talk to my mum. Well, this will all blow over. For now, just go home, go live with your family home with your parents, and I'll come and get you. So she goes, but her family starts pressuring her to marry another man. They're originally understanding that she wants to wait, but eventually she receives an offer from the son of a very powerful man, and so pressured by her brother, she gives in. The clerk gets wind of this, and they meet. Sobbing, she says, since I took leave of you, unimaginable things have happened. I can no longer be true, though I doubt you'll get it. And somewhat caustically, he responds, I compliment you on your rise in the world. The boulder is square and solid. It can last for 1,000 years. Oh, I'm true. I'm faithful. But the rush of the reed, its moment lost, no longer than dawn to dusk. You know, real Kosi fan Tute kind of stuff. She is having none of this. She protests, and they agree that they will die rather than be parted in life. So on the day that she is supposed to go and be married to this new man, she drowns herself and he hangs himself, and they are buried together, and the trees on their grave entwine, and mandarin ducks call night after night. It's very atmospheric. And this became a very popular story later in China. In the bottom right, there's a picture of a Peking opera or Beijing opera adaptation of this. And there's also a costume drama that you can watch if you are interested. So this is very clearly a narrative poem. You can see why he wanted to translate this story poem and not maybe history poem. And if Hu Shi is right, it was the result of oral circulation. But really, it's not very long. So just the bit that I've quoted here is about a quarter of it. So In terms of subject matter, it's romantic. We saw in James's talk that the Georgian epics feature a lot of romance. It's not necessarily being romantic in itself that's an issue, but this is kind of very low-level romance. This isn't princes and kings and knights. This is, you know, your mate next door and his wife, right? This is very popular, very grassroots. So 胡适, with the aim of raising the status of vernacular and popular literature, is really only considering orality, meter, and narrative as the primary criteria for epic. It seems that over time, scholars in China were less concerned about establishing the existence of an ancient epic to rival Homer's and turned their attention instead to living performance traditions. This parallels the shift in focus in Western epic studies from epic as the pinnacle of Western civilization, the peak of elite and high culture, to something more grassroots, something more popular, an object of anthropological or ethnographical investigation, as more living epic traditions were discovered. Wu Mi identified a series of similarities between Chinese tanci, a form of oral storytelling accompanied by music, which is why plucked, and the Homeric epics, including the performance context and the use of formulae. Several later scholars also took up this idea, with Chen Yanke especially singling out karmic bonds of reincarnation, 在生缘, which was written in the Qing dynasty by a female author, Chen Duansheng. These perhaps adhere more closely to more common modern definitions of epics, but these forms of literature have always been looked down on in China, so they certainly don't hold the same kind of cultural prestige. It's difficult to consider it a one-on-one match. Let's watch a few videos of the kind of storytelling forms that are being talked about. So first is a Wenzhou drum lyric from the southeast of China, which is, so it's in Wenzhounese and from a region that's near Shanghai. And this is a love story that involves the mistaking of fans.
有一个中头写家自江西呗，肉卷呀张开人，呀娃王家学这个门，这家默默就外长，呀娃让该对养过，让家女用西白长，呀娃知道自江西，还没头开口那样。 呀娃大西外人去，同伴学在路飞扬，飞扬学在父子歌。这个没用西呀，其实比都是多哎，只讲咩。
The other video I wanted to show you is a story that this time it's a northern tale. Well, it's not a northern tale, but it's a northern performance, and it's from the very famous Journey to the West, which is a kind of selection of stories in which based on the true story from when a Tang Dynasty monk travels from China to India to collect the Buddhist texts, and he takes them back to China and gives them to the emperor. So that's the historical event. In the story, however, he is also accompanied by many magical sidekicks. So you've got the Shasung monk here on the right, and then a sort of anthropomorphized pig called Zhou Bajie, and who fights with a rake that you can see here. He's riding a horse that's really a dragon, and the most popular, the most important figure is Sun Wukong, who is a monkey, and he's a very powerful monkey who goes causing havoc in heaven, and he does this particular pose, and a lot of the story, the Journey to the West, is him beating up a bunch of demons on the way to India. And many people read this as a kind of pilgrim's progress, an allegory for reaching enlightenment.
说的是唐僧到西天去取经，师徒四人跋山涉水的赶路程。唐僧
I'm going to try that again. Sorry, it wasn't playing properly for me.
说的是 唐僧到西天去取经，师徒4人跋山涉水的赶路程。唐僧他骑着一匹白龙马，猪八戒沙僧左右不离的紧跟行。看，开路先锋在头前走，他就是大闹天宫的齐天大圣孙悟空。说这一天，他们师徒4人走进那个荒山里，见座座高山险又凶，怪石横生悬崖陡，这峭壁1000丈入云层。突然间有一团乌云压山顶啊，呼，平地就刮起了一阵风。孙悟空他的手搭凉棚，高声喊：实力注意，这个地方有妖精。沙和尚一听，
so you can see there are tons of oral storytelling traditions within China that some people have linked up with epic. And these Chinese oral storytelling traditions long ago resulted in what are known as the classic Chinese novels. So one of them is Journey to the West that we just talked about. There's also The Water Margin, which some people see as China's Robin Hood. It's to do with a group of righteous bandits. And the third, well, the 3 of maybe 4 or even up to 6, is the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is based on the historical period following the fall of the Han, in which 3 kingdoms are competing for hegemony. And all of these circulated orally for centuries before they were actually put together and written up as novels, which we can talk about afterwards, but that brings up some of the questions we were talking about on Friday to do with authorship. In terms of subject matter, I think that these are perhaps the most epic-like of everything we've looked at. And they're also very, very long, with each of them running to 4 or 5 big volumes in English translation. But crucially, they're written in prose, vernacular prose at that, denying them both true respectability in the traditional Chinese canon and the quality of meter that has been seen as so important in defining an epic. From the 1950s onwards, China found its own bona fide, indisputable epics. So in a 2018 speech, Xi Jinping claimed that China has inherited the soul-shaking great epics of King Gaizar, Manas, and Jangar, the national epics of the Tibetan people, the Kyrgyz people, and the Mongolian people, respectively. So allegedly, Xi mispronounced the word Gaizar as Sager, driving home that these epics may be Chinese in the sense that they are the cultural heritage of peoples who are official minority ethnicities and legal citizens within the People's Republic of China, but they're not Chinese in the sense of the Han cultural tradition, which is of course what the other people we've looked at were really thinking of. There have been great drives in recent years in China to gather and record oral epics from people of minority ethnicities all around China. So the 100 Epics of China project has been launched. These are just the first 9 of the 100 of different peoples from around China. And they define epic as a long form, verso-prosometric being a combination of verse and prose, historic, oral, narrative, passed down through the generations. So unlike in the early 20th century, it seems no longer to be felt that there is a need to find an ancient Han Chinese epic when there are so many living epics within Chinese borders, and the definition can then be fairly strict. Not only do contemporary scholars agree that there is no longer a need to go imposing Western values on the Chinese literary system and go searching for the Chinese epic, some have even argued that the Western category of epic itself is flawed. So Gong Pengchong goes so far as to claim that Western literary thought has been completely mistaken in believing that an epic is a poem. Quoting Edgar Allan Poe's words, the phrase "a long poem" is simply a flat contradiction in terms. So according to him, only lyric poetry, that is poetry expressing one's inner emotions and not telling a story, actually counts as poetry, as in the more traditional Chinese conception. Personally, I think that just as it might be a mistake to impose Western ideas on China, this seems to me to be quite an inappropriate and a little patronizing imposition of China's cultural values on the West. But it does raise questions about how we divvy up literature. Is it to do with form? Is it to do with content? Is it to do with whether it's expression or telling a story? And how these categorizations move across cultures. So to conclude, this has been a story of contestation, whether that's contesting the boundaries of what constitutes an epic, how long is long, can it be in verse, what kind of subject matter can count, does it have to be to do with religion, does it have to have kind of gods and mythology, can it be drama, what really counts as an epic? And secondly, contesting traditional conceptions of literary value. One of the things that I'm really interested in, and that's come up over this weekend as well, is the sort of competing understandings of the high epic of the sort of Homeric tradition and how that became really valorized and put at the center of the canon in the West, and then kind of so-called low epic of more grassroots, more popular kind of living traditions. And it seems pretty clear that people in early 20th century China, depending partly on their kind of ideological bent, took different bits, not only from the different criteria of epic, but also the kind of highness or the lowness. And that's something that I think can deserve more thought. And finally, contesting the imposition of Western literary categorizations in non-European contexts. So, I mean, I think we can agree it doesn't really matter that China didn't produce a Homeric epic, right? This certainly doesn't make it a less sophisticated or a less imaginative civilization. But the many fascinating routes taken on the quest to find the Chinese epic, I think raise important questions about the genre and its translocation. We see many facets of epic, and it's very interesting to see which ones people decided to look at. And so, yeah, I hope to discuss some of these questions with everyone now. I've just put a few bits of further reading if anyone is interested. And once again, thanks so much to Paul. I've really, really been enjoying this.